So I'm going to pause the recording.
Surbhi Sinha, who is the director of the South Asia Institute at SOAS and who will be chairing today's session. So without further ado, I will hand over to Surbhi. The structure of our book panels, which we will follow today, is 30 minutes or so for reviewing for the authors to speak about the book, followed by 15-20 minutes maximum for discussants, and then it will be open to the audience. We will aim to finish by 5 to 4 or so. So that's the structure of today's session. A warm welcome to you all, and especially to Professor Tarunabh Khaitan, who's made the time during a very, very busy day. We've been trying to get him over to SOAS for quite a long time, and I'm delighted that this has been possible today. Thank you very much, Tarun, for doing this in the midst of a very, very busy period.
Thank you very much, Rochana. Thank you very much for coming. And of course, thank you to Tarun and to Surbhi, who is joining us, I believe, from Australia. This is also very good from the point of view of the overall idea that we want to do more and more events between the LSE and SOAS, and in fact, across the London colleges. I'm sure many of you have already looked up Tarun's kind of entry on the LSE webpage. But very briefly, he is the professor and the chair of public law at the LSE Law School, and is also an honorary professional fellow at the Melbourne Law School. He has been previously the head of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford, and the professor of public law and legal theory at Oxford, as well as a vice dean and a visiting professor of law at a number of places. He's prolific in terms of his publication of books. Let me quickly run through just a few. A theory of discrimination law that came out of OUP in 2015. And then we have also, he's co-edited the Foundation of Indirect Discrimination Law with Bloomsbury in 2018. Constitutional Resilience in South Asia, co-edited with Swati Javeri and Dr. Dinesh Samaratne, also from Bloomsbury in 2023. The Entrenchment of Democracy, which came out co-edited with Professors Tom Ginsberg and Aziz Haq from Cambridge University Press 2024. And I'm particularly delighted to see this book in Hindi, Hum Bharat Ke Log, We the People of India. Earlier on today, I was just in a conversation with Rochana that actually I wrote
You've written a piece with exactly that title.
For a Hindi journal called Lokmat in 2023. So it'd be a real pleasure to hear from Tarun about what he the arguments of the book, and as well as the ways in which this might animate conversations in the current context. Also, very nice to welcome Surbhi Karwa. Surbhi is currently doing a PhD at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where she's looking at the sort of intersections between parliamentary discourses on equality and their real life sort of instantiations. She's also been a senior associate, a research associate at the CJLS, as well as being a lecturer at the Global Law School. And she's previously done a graduate degree at the University of Oxford, and has had previous degrees from the National Law University, Delhi, and with the Ramanohar Lohia National Law University in Lucknow. So without taking any further time, let's pass it on to Surbhi first, and then maybe to Tarun, and then towards once they're done, I'll sort of farm out questions and answers as they come from the floor or as they come from the online audience. So please, Surbhi, over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to Rochana, Udit, Nida, and all the members of PACT for organizing this book talk. And also congratulations on organizing the exhibition. Whatever I'm seeing online and from whatever I've heard from people, it's a very promising endeavor. I wish I was in London to attend it, but probably next time. So Tarun and I decided that I'm gonna first walk through what were the aims with which we wrote this book, and then take you through the structure of the book, that what we are doing. in different parts of the book, and then Tarun would highlight some of the specifics that he specifically wanted to talk about today. So the Indian Constitution is quite a popular document. In previous election, it became a star of the show. There were a lot of people who said that Constitution need to be saved. We do not see any tanks or any coup happening in India the way we have seen in some of the other democracies, but yet there was an assertion that the Indian Constitution is under threat. Then there are a couple of people who say that Indian Constitution is colonial, it's foreign, it's copied, it does not reflect Indian sentiments. There are another set of people who have also argued that it centralizes power. And despite 75 years, despite the promise of equality and liberty in our constitution, we see those values not being followed completely in our country. We also saw in 2019, amidst anti-CAA protests, we saw public reading of the preamble. The preamble and the constitution became a tool for mobilization. We have also seen in recent past movies made around provisions of the constitution, talking specifically of different parts of the constitution. So clearly our constitution is quite popular and it's relevant document to us. We also know in general parlance that our constitution provides us rights. But a constitution, and the constitution of ours, which is very long, it also provides basic governance of our country. Despite all of these conversations, there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity, especially amongst public. The public discourse doesn't really clarify that what is our constitution, what are the institutions in it, what are the limits, what are the good points, what are the things working, what are the things not working. So that we thought is a gap which we intended to fulfill with a book that intends to speak to a broader audience than just academic audience, but it also intends to ensure that it's nuance, it's explaining things, it's not just giving a hagiographic account of the constitution, just celebratory account. It is trying to explain different institutions and their merits and demerits. So that's the aim of the book. The book originated with Tarun first writing a audio for The Wire during the anti-CAA protest, explaining preamble of the constitution. We have various words in the preamble. He wrote a video about it. And then with Rajesh Ranjan, who is, I'd like to congratulate him. He's a Shivling Scholar this year and would be joining you all in London pretty soon. So with Rajesh, we started a monthly podcast with Live Law, trying to explain different parts of the Constitution. So if you would notice, there is a bit of a conversational tone in the book, and that is because that is the origin of the book, because we wanted to speak to a broader audience. With Rajesh's help, Kundan Social Legal Literary, which is their organization working on constitutional literacy in India, we recorded multiple podcasts during pandemic for almost a year. And that's how the idea of the book came about. Now, coming to the structure of the book is broadly divided into three parts. Part one begins with beginning. It begins with the preamble of the Constitution, where we have tried explaining each word of the Constitution, some of them less controversial, some more controversial, particularly socialist and secular, where we have seen in recent past discourse that these words were not there in the Constitution. They've been brought later, they should be replaced with some other word. So we have tried explaining that whether that is a correct claim or is it a misleading claim. We have also tried explaining concepts which have been less talked about, concepts like fraternity and what is fraternity's connection with fundamental rights that have been provided in the Constitution. Then the second chapter of the first part attempts to explain the process of the making of the Constitution. With Constituent Assembly, we often hear people say that it was imposed. We have tried looking and explaining through this chapter whether that was the case. We have argued in this chapter that the Constituent Assembly brought all sorts of different ideological groups in the Constitution, and those sometimes complementary, sometimes contradictory claims find place in the Constitution. If we look at the constitutional literature, the average life of a constitution in Tom Ginsburg and others' work is said to be 19 years. But the Indian constitution is a survivor constitution, is surviving in some form for 75 years. So we tried to trace that whether the way the constitution was written, the way Constituent Assembly was formed, whether that played any role. We tried explaining DPSPs and their connection with the fundamental right in this chapter. Then in the second part, we move to the words that we hear very often, words like rule of law, democracy, federalism, liberalism, but these words are both underused and overused. We sometimes also use them rhetorically, not quite understanding what does it mean. So we have tried explaining these concepts, their origin, through scholars like Dicey and Montesquieu, and to also bring them in a particular our context. So for example, in rule of law chapter, we have tried connecting it with the laws like UAPA that we have today, that what does it do to rule of law? Or the creation of CBI, for example, under the Delhi Special Police Act. So we have tried connecting those concepts to very concrete examples to understand them. Then similarly, we've tried explaining the word liberalism, which again, we hear a lot in our discourse without much reflection on what does that mean. Similarly, in the chapter on democracy, we've heard the word that Indian democracy is under threat. So we tried explaining what exactly is democracy and what is it that is under threat. Is democracy equivalent of majoritarianism? Because we often hear the word that we are a government which has majority votes. Does that amount to making a claim that we have a democratic legitimacy? So we've tried explaining democracy and various institutions that form that democracy. So we've tried explaining the role of fourth branches, academic institution, press, the role of political parties and opposition, that we again don't hear a lot in public discourse. So we've tried explaining democracy and different aspects of the constitution they are relevant to, and along with the electoral system. And when we say that it's not a hagiographic account, this chapter highlights that, because we have tried showing that what are the problems with the electoral system and what impact does it have on Indian democracy. And finally, we move on to federalism, explaining concepts like symmetric and asymmetric federalism. This is in light of discussions around some states having some special provisions in the constitution and what is the relevance of those provisions. And finally, part 3 of the book is one chapter on citizenship, because the origin of the book, the idea of the book is in anti-CAA protest. So we've tried explaining the Indian citizenship law, and it's becoming more and more relevant with what is happening in Assam and potential NRC across country. So we've tried explaining the journey of citizenship law from the founding movement, what is the impact that partition had on it, and what are the models of citizenship we have followed, and ultimately what we have arrived at in 2019. So this is the broad structure. And of course, this is not a complete account. We could cover only as much. Perhaps there is more to write. There are a couple of points that need to be clarified about the book. First, it is a book that does not settle all the debates that we have around the Constitution. It simply intends to introduce the broader concepts of Constitution and the values and the institutions that are there. As I've said, it's not a hagiographic account. Third, it's in Hindi. And I'm very happy that my parents are here today. That's for the first time they've been able to attend some talk that I am doing. And for both me and Tarun, our parents were one of the motivators, because we both wanted our parents to read the work that we can write. So thank you मेरे मम्मी पापा को कि वो यहाँ आज मेरे साथ हैं. पहली बार उनको भी मौका मिला कि मेरा काम वो सुने और पढ़ें. So thank you to them. I'll also like to thank Saif, who's been very supportive throughout the process. He's a lawyer, but he's also a language expert. So it was great to talk to him in his two hats. And the book is only in Hindi, because both Tarun and I, apart from English, are good in Hindi. We both hope that this may lead to more books in more different Indian languages. With that, thank you so much.
Over to you now, Tarun.
Well, thank you very much first to Rochana and the Pact Project for organizing this and for launching the book in mid-September, which is basically August, because people are still coming back from the holidays, term hasn't started. And thank you all for showing up. Before I say anything else, I just want to pay tribute to a great scholar and dear friend, Connor Getty, who passed away last week. And in remembering Connor here is particularly apt because he was one of those scholars who spoke not just in the academy but outside, and made it a life's mission to engage with the world beyond the academy. There are a couple of copies of the book in the room. Please don't take them. I've received very few other copies, but you're welcome to keep them and circulate them and have a look at them. This has been a hard book to write. So those of you who are from India or understand India know that almost all of the scholarship in India is done in English. And our brains really found it a challenge to work in Hindi. We were looking at Google Translate a lot, but also it was a hard book to write because we were not just writing in a different language, we were also writing for an audience that is completely different from the one we normally write for. This wasn't meant for an academic audience. It's what is called a trade book. We're writing for a generalist audience, and that compounded the challenge. And then the third was not, we did not obviously want it to be one of those books where you use highly Sanskritized, extremely technical, made up Hindi words. So we borrowed, we used English loan words as they would be in colloquial Hindi. But the third struggle was to bring a slightly more Hindustani register to the text. And I was self-conscious, but it might come across perhaps as less elegant for that reason, because neither Surbhi nor I speak fluent Urdu. But given the aims and ambitions of the project, and given our own politics, we were quite keen to write the book in a register that wasn't entirely Sanskritic, that at least nodded to India's Persian heritage as well. Of course, this is also not a very polished book. We worked with a very big Indian press, but you will find lacunas in copy editing, etc. Please forgive us for that. The point of the book, and what we would like to be judged by, is the confidence that we hope the book will give to other scholars who have never considered writing in non-English Indian languages. And the hope is that this is not a book that was written in English and then translated into Hindi. Interestingly now, Penguin India has been in touch, wanting to do an English translation of the book, which is interesting. We didn't start with English, and we know that a lot of books written in English have been translated. But that is for us the mark of success, that we want other scholars to see that this is doable, that hopefully audiences will be more forgiving for an early effort. So as Surbhi has already said, our goal was also, in a very sharply divided political discourse where you were either for the Constitution or against it, we wanted to write a book defending the liberal, democratic, secular Constitution without it being a hagiography. And that is the theme I want to expand on in this talk. So this is, everything I'm going to say today is not in the book. These are things that I've thought since writing the book, but I think they are pertinent to the book. I should also contextualize the book's publication in a context in which scholars, public intellectuals like Yogendra Yadav have already declared the First Republic to be dead. So maybe we are talking about a constitution that no longer lives. Now, I have my doubts. I don't know whether the constitution can still be saved or restored or revived or rescued, whatever we might think about its current status. There is a question mark about where we are today. And the irony of our times is that while, on the one hand, people like Yogendra Yadav have said that the First Republic is dead, the Constitution in the Indian public discourse has become the only normative register that is acceptable across the partisan divide. There is nothing else, definitely not morality, certainly not religion, not international law, nothing else that all key political players, or most key political players, at least pay their service to, at least accept the normative authority of, albeit for performative purposes, including the ruling BJP, like maybe for electoral expediency or whatever. But so it's a moment in which a criticism that is framed in constitutional terms matters in the public discourse in a way that a straightforward moral criticism simply does not. Now, that may be unfortunate. When saying that something is unconstitutional is worse than saying something, killing people is wrong. When that becomes worse, there is something sad about the human condition, but that is the reality of it today. And that is the context in which, when the main political fight is between those who want to save the Constitution, those who are allegedly destroying it, how do the people of India understand the Constitution? And understand the Constitution beyond its preamble. That was the challenge that we set to ourselves, right? And obviously, we started with the language that both of us speak, and also the language spoken by the majority, not a majority, plurality of the people of India, the largest linguistic group. So a nuanced explanation of the Constitution beyond the symbolic and the performative. That is the goal. Now, this nuance between complete rejection and hagiography, what is that space, right? I wish I thought of this when we were writing the book, but now I think that India's constitution operates at two different frames, at two different levels. It has a higher normative aspirational register, a register of ambition, of ideas, of values, which are eternal, which are abiding, which are universal, which are also deeply Indian because they reflect the ethos of India's freedom struggle against colonialism. And ideas and values in this first register have acquired at least a doctrinal stability because of the Supreme Court's invocation of the basic structure doctrine. It is this high register of the Constitution that I believe the court has said constitutes its basic structure and therefore is unamendable. That even following the process of amendment prescribed in the Constitution, this cannot be changed because this is the bit that gives the Constitution its identity. But there is a second register to this Constitution. And like all detailed, long constitutions, this is inevitable. Maybe the very short American style Constitution, I don't think the American Constitution is an exception either, by the way. But maybe it's possible for short visionary constitutions to only speak in one register. But any constitution that engages with levels of detail with any degree of granularity, the second register is inevitable. And this is the nuts and bolts of the Constitution. The granular, the compromise and consensus driven, maybe the ugly or the less pretty, the dynamic part of the Constitution. This is the grubbier dimension, which is what requires constant improvement. And the reason why we need to distinguish between these two registers is I fear that the current political discourse run by the political opposition of saving the Constitution may end up entrenching not just the first register, but also the second. That tomorrow, if the opposition comes to power, it would be a legitimate question to pose to any constitutional amendment they might want to enact to improve the Constitution, to reduce some of its less democratic dimensions, like the office of the appointed governors, like the Constitution's sanction for preventive detention. So it's really important that this nuanced space is insisted upon in public discourse, not just for better understanding, but also because we should make sure that we don't tie our hands and stop an organic development of the Constitution, which, by the way, the framers understood it, which, by the way, was the main reason why they adopted a tiered understanding of constitutional amendments and made certain types of amendments to the Constitution extremely easy, because they had the self-awareness to not trust their judgments fully, but also realized that they were being pragmatic and settling for things that they hoped future generations would improve upon. So the second point I want to make, and Surbhi again touched upon this in her talk about the colonial slur on the Constitution. There have been two important works that have been published recently. One by Orgo Sengupta called Our Colonial Constitution, and another a trilogy of works by Sai Deepak. I believe only the first two books are currently out. And this trilogy, I've written a blog post on the LSE blogs recently with the South Asia Center that Nilanjan runs, engaging with this kind of argument that the Indian Constitution is a colonial document. And I have two things to say. You can read my blog about the point-by-point engagement with the kind of argument that Sai Deepak makes, which I just think is factually untrue. Whatever you think about it normatively, it's just factually not true that constitutional values were imposed, because it makes a mockery not just of 200 years of freedom struggle, or 100 years or 50 years, depending on when you start counting, but also a very long, much longer tradition of Indian engagement with values, which, I mean, the only way you can ignore, you can say these values are not Indian is if you think of Buddhism and Jainism and the Bhakti movement and Akbar and Ashoka and Sufism as not Indian. Because the Constitution's values, perhaps articulated in a different register, speak to, nod to a long history of various of these values found in it. And of course, the colonized imagination argument is an unfalsifiable. Accusing the founders of having colonized imaginations because they disagreed with you, there's no way to dispute it. There's no way to prove it. It's also demeaning. It betrays the same colonial assumption that Indians cannot think for themselves. But more worrying for me about the argument from decoloniality, or at least from decolonial theory in particular, which by the way is not just an Indian phenomenon. We're seeing this in South Africa as well and many other former colonies. This is, I don't believe, simply a case of an abusive use of a progressive idea. I think the problem is not a bug, it's a feature. And the problem is the inbuilt anti-normativity in decolonial theory and its affiliate ideas like critical legal studies, critical race theory, post-colonialism, etc. And I understand, I get the importance of thinking about power, because power embeds all our social relations, and without understanding power, our scholarship is pointless. But I care about power because power for me, and especially its abuse, is a normative phenomenon. I care about power because morality should care about power. When we start saying that morality itself is an expression of power and therefore we should discard morality as entirely European and colonial, this is what we get. We get a fascist doctrine of decolonial theory. Having given up on normativity, having given up on morality, we then have denied to ourselves the resources of speaking to, relying on reason and universal human values. And that, I think, is the final point I would make and stop here. So thank goodness our Constitution, in its high register, speaks of values that are eternal, that are universal, and of course embedded and located in a particular context and with an Indian flag. But it is that importance of normativity in our Constitution with an eye to power that I think we need to defend, rescue, and celebrate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
First discussant is Dr. Udit Bhatia, King's College London, who's also a key constituent of PACT.
I'd like to start by thanking Surbhi and Tarunabh for writing this book. It's a much needed Hindi language commentary on Indian constitutionalism and democracy in India. It's been written with the exemplary clarity that both of them have displayed in their previous work. It's rich, ambitious, and covers a lot of ground. I'd also like to thank Tarun for opening up a dialogue on normativity, because most of my questions are about the normative conceptions in the book. Primarily centered around chapter 5, democracy. As a political theorist working on democracy, you'll probably be no surprise that this is a chapter where most of my comments focus on. So my first question to both authors is, they could say a bit more about their normative conception of democracy. Now, their starting definition of democracy in the book is twofold. It's a system where all are considered equal, and secondly, each one's opinion is given equal importance. Now, later, they note that democracy in its contemporary form, especially in large states, means representative democracy. So governing, they rightly note, requires capability, understanding of compromise, meeting with people with opposed views, coping with criticism of their views in the media, giving account of their decision in parliament elections, and cultivating all these capacities requires experience. And I suppose I agree with most of this, but I have 5 questions. Firstly, how is this conception of democracy, equality of citizens, and equal consideration of views connected with their comments on representative democracy? And I'll say more about this in a moment. But secondly, I can see why experience is necessary for the kind of governing virtues they highlight, right? Ability to compromise, meet with people with different views. But I think they're also glossing over some of the darker side of experience. So empirical research shows us, for example, that experienced politicians are less likely to spend time on constituency work or to join select committees, that they're more career-driven, that they are less likely to compromise with rival parties, they tend to toe the party line much more often. And more importantly, that career politicians place a higher premium on career advancement rather than they spend more time on career advancement, place a higher premium on it than less experienced politicians. We also know, again from empirical research, that more experienced politicians are more out of touch. They live in a social bubble, a political bubble. Their greater proximity to donors means that they're less aware of the hardships facing the average constituents. There's been some really interesting empirical work showing the wide gap between experienced politicians and the average voter. And all of this is to say that Surbhi and Tarun might want to at least pause and admit that governing may require experience, but that experience is correlated with negative democratic effects. And this may at the very least spark off conversation about what we can do about those negative effects, rather than seeing experience as an unalloyed democratic good. Thirdly, I'm not quite sure why they equate representative democracy with experience. As recent work in political philosophy shows, this experience can emerge from institutions that aren't comprised of elected representatives. One can, for example, have citizens' assemblies, juries with rotating membership, where some members stay on while a new cohort is admitted. And I know Tarun is critical of sortition-like measures, and perhaps Surbhi is as well. But I think we need a clearer statement of why experience accrued through these non-electoral forms of representation would not suffice, because at the moment the defense of representative democracy rests on experience, at least as it's framed in the book. I'll now come back to what I said about their conception of democracy. I can see from the book why there might be a clear instrumentalist case for representative government. It delivers good governance, and if we agree with many of their premises, we're on solid ground. Democracy means representative democracy, because any other form of popular government, more direct form of government, would just have catastrophic consequences. But that leads me back to their definition. Their definition of democracy rests on two big normative values: equality of citizens and equal consideration. And I'd like to hear more about how representative democracy, or at least the way we know it today, satisfies those normative values. Because I can see many issues with the link between political equality and representative democracy, which celebrates experience. Most average citizens simply do not have the capacity to become experienced career politicians. They don't have the capacity to become long-term politicians, to acquire the experience that Tarun and Surbhi think is good for democracy. And if that's the case, then there might be a tension between their definition, between their normative conception of democracy and the instrumental consequence-facing analysis that they offer. It might be that instrumentally, democracy should be representative democracy, even if this violates some of our normative commitments about political equality. And I have a final comment on this. I think Surbhi and Tarun are too quick to contrast representative democracy with historical forms of democracy, the kind we find in ancient Greece, focusing on randomization and sortition. I think there are ways of combining these two, of creating mixed constitutions that benefit from a professional political class, but also institutions which mitigate some of the risks that the professionalization of politics carries, that representative democracy carries. And it's likely that we'll still want representative democracy as our overarching frame. But there may be elements of more popular constitutionalism that could be embedded in representative democracy, perhaps in a consultative capacity, perhaps in a non-binding capacity, as simply a wee adjunct to representative institutions which still remain primary. And that's the lesson that we get from recent work on oligarchic constitutionalism from people like John McCormick, Camilla Vergara, and Enzo Rossi. It's also a lesson we get from the margins of India's Constituent Assembly, and a lesson we get from India's left parties through the first 3 decades of Indian independence. In other words, I wonder if Tarun and Surbhi are open to softening the hard line that they're drawing between representative democracy and other forms of democracy. So that's in sum the first question. The second question I have is about their theory of political competition. Now, their view of democracy rests, I think, on an unexplained libertarian style view. Of course, I'm not saying that Surbhi and Tarun are libertarians, but I do think they're resting on a very particular vision of political competition, of the political marketplace. And it's a view that goes like this: horizontal accountability keeps governments in check. In fact, they argue at some point, I'm translating and apologies for the bad translation, the fear of losing the next election compels the government to not take steps which the electorate does not support. So the view is that competition disciplines political leaders. The fear of losing is sufficient to align political leaders with public interests. When it does not, this means that the market is not working properly because political competition may have been rigged. And that's why vertical accountability is important. Keep competition fair. But once competition is fair, governments are less likely to act systematically against the average voter. Now, I think this is a perfectly understandable view of democracy. It's a view of democracy that Downsian analysts have pushed for years, a view of democracy that's recently been revived by proponents of the responsible government traditions, people like Ian Shapiro and Nancy Rosenblatt. But it's also a view that relies on very substantive assumptions, which I'd like to push them on. I think we need to be clearer about why competition has these public interest effects. And the first challenge is empirical. As with economic markets, political markets are known to not function in the way that this libertarian style view suggests. So we know that political parties can converge on policies and positions. They don't have to sit in a conspiratorial smoke-filled room. They nevertheless converge on policies and positions because they know what's in the interests of donors, they know what's in the interests of big businesses and what might cause capital flight. And that means they avoid confrontation with wealthy elites. This type of market failure of political competition, is well documented around the world. And nor indeed does their reliance on fourth branch institutions insulate us from this market failure. After all, oligarchic control seeps into every major civil society organization that can start to wield influence. So if we're relying on fair competition on a level playing field to curb the power of economic elites, that's not going to work, not just in unequal society, but research shows that this is also the case in social democracies in Scandinavia. So I'm not as optimistic about the picture of political competition that they offer us in this book. But setting aside the empirical question, my question for Surbhi and Tarun is, what is your theory of political competition? Why assume that political competition makes political elites act in the public interest? What substantive assumptions about competition and its effects go into this view of horizontal accountability? To be clear, I don't think that this view is implausible, but I do think it's more controversial, more substantially thick than the chapter would make us think. And I think I'll stop there and hand over to Rochana.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Tarun and Surbhi for bringing these important questions into our midst. I think it's, even as the Indian Constitution has become a really much discussed subject, almost all the work, as you say, is in English. And this book addresses a really important lacuna, which is the scarcity of nuanced scholarship in Hindi and constitutional commentary in Hindi, and that's much desired in our times. We know that there are around 530 million people in India who register as Hindi as their first language, and another 580 million who say that it's their second. And it's a credit to the book that it takes this into account while also cautioning us against majoritarianism, against, if you like, a dominance by numbers. So I like both of those elements in the book very much. I share, and in fact, we collectively share many of the key themes that are raised in the book. How the survival of the Indian Constitution is an achievement. Indeed, agreement on the Indian Constitution itself was an achievement, as we tried to show in a world in which the average age of the Constitution is less than 20 years. That our Constitution is not colonial, and we need to think in more nuanced and sophisticated ways about what is colonialism, that we have to take into account how liberal values, what is called Udarvad, I think, was a key constituent of our freedom struggle, that we can't understand the freedom struggle without taking liberal ideas in the freedom struggle seriously. And how there were multiple departures between For example, the 1935 Constitution, from which the Indian Constitution took a lot, but not universal adult franchise and not fundamental rights, as Tarun and Surbhi discuss. I also like very much the reading of the Constitution as a liberal egalitarian framework in sort of, and that's the overall normative position that I think is correctly articulated in the book. And that it was by valuing agreement on and not on insisting on the power of numbers. The Congress Party then had the numbers. It could have pushed through an elite's narrow vision of what the Constitution should be, of the leadership's vision, of a Nehru Patel vision, but that did not happen. The Constitution cannot be seen as reflecting the vision of any single leader, not Nehru, not Patel, not even Ambedkar. So how compromises and principled compromises were arrived at in the making of the Constitution, and how liberal principles were a part of this story. The accommodation of those of minority opinion, of minority groups, was significant. This really important element is discussed at length, and I applaud that in the book. 3 quick questions. And we've already hinted at some of those, Tarun, in your remarks. I really liked your use of Hindi in a way that incorporates both Hindustani and English that Francesca has written about, and that we need to think more rigorously about. So you talk about Shaktishali survivor, and that loktantra ko switch nahi hai jo sirf on off kar sakte hain, then you consciously use these English words, and of course many others. But Udarvad, for example, is a less well-known term, and it's not a term of popular discourse as much of popular discourse in Hindi. And this must have been this, and at other places you must have faced dilemmas, linguistic choice dilemmas in your writing. And could you take us behind the scenes to how you what were some of these linguistic choice dilemmas that you faced, and how did you resolve these, and how you see your Hindi as different from the Hindi, the translation of the Constitution in Hindi. So linguistically, it's apt that at SOAS, we do start with the language question, if you like. So I would love to know more about how, what were the main sort of linguistic challenges that you encountered in this, and how you dealt with this. A second point that you also discuss, and indeed I share with you, and these are questions also to us collectively, you speak about how constitutional longevity or stability is a good thing, and some of the evidence for this, for example, is provided by Ginsburg and Elkins in the book. And can you amplify a bit on this? Because again, coming from an alternative standpoint, you could say, well, constitutional stability is not necessarily a virtue, not always a good thing. Many proponents of decolonizing constitution making, Richard Albert and others who we heard from last week talk about why for progressive aims we need to be able to change constitutions, etc., and change and the extent to which change can't happen. There's of course the link of that to the democratic question, which is what is the conception, as it were, of democracy here that would allow us to incorporate both stability around basic structure and progressive change that we've also seen in some areas of the Constitution. The third question is about, I liked very much also your account of liberal ideologies as being multidimensional and also as related to constitutionalism. Could you amplify a bit more about this relationship between liberalism and constitutionalism? And in particular, you talked about positive constitutionalism, but not so much about positive freedom or positive liberalism. Now, some of those who've written about liberal ideas in India, like myself, have said that indeed, and you define liberalism in a in a way that we need to remind ourselves of today, which is that it's an ideology which seeks to limit government. That's absolutely central. But you also recognize in your discussion of positive constitutionalism that the Indian government, in a way, and in the Indian constitution, not government so much, but it was the constitution makers at that time sought to empower the government in order to achieve positive ends, right? Because there was a sense that the individual, in order to achieve individual freedom, the state needed to be empowered in order to achieve progressive aims, and that was a reason why Ambedkar and Nehru both then, in the end, go for a strong center, which then doesn't take into account some of the concerns of negative liberals, which is that an empowered or an overpowerful state can trample roughshod on personal freedoms and the rights of individuals. So could you just amplify a bit more on this relation, how you understand this relationship between positive constitutionalism and positive freedom in the Indian constitution, and what the differences between these might be? Would you say, I've said, but you don't have to agree, that there wasn't a strong enough elaboration of the reasons for negative freedom, for limiting government there was in the freedom struggle, but not in the making of the Indian constitution. So a part of the freedom struggle that didn't get translated, if you like, into the making of the Indian constitution. Is that something you would concur with, or if you could amplify that? But more than anything, this is a great book. It's really stimulating and achieves an enviable clarity and nuance alongside accessibility. So I would urge you to read it.
Yeah. Perhaps both of you could have 5 minutes.
Yeah, so
I can go first, and is that okay?
go ahead. Yeah.
So I'll start with Udit's question. I think I'd like to contextualize a bit where we were having, where the chapter on democracy is. First, you read it very minutely, so I'm very thankful that you've paid such deep attention to it. I think the discussion on representative democracy, I have 3 points to make on that. That first, it was in context of we were talking of direct democracy, and there seems to be even a public discourse of seeing that from a direct democracy as necessarily a good thing. So the bit about representative democracy was to present the merits of representative democracy as somewhat opposed to direct democracy, to understand the value of having political parties and politicians. So that's one location where that is situated, where the democracy discussion, what is the audience it's responding to? Within that, I think I also see that bit as our conversation on constitution tends to be a lot more court focused, that what courts can do or cannot do. But if you go, I'm from Jodhpur, if you go to a person in Jodhpur and ask about the name of the Chief Justice of India, he or she may probably not know, but they would know the name of the MP of their area. So for me, that bit was also to sort of just highlight political parties and our representatives as part of the constitution, as constitutional actors, and their role in this conversation. So for me, it was also in that context to just present a defense is the wrong word, but just the role that politicians have also played. And some of my work, particularly in context of social justice and reservations, the parliament and representatives have done, I would say, a good job. So, and that is not to say that all of their actions can be sort of defensible. And as you pointed out, multiple empirical studies, perhaps we couldn't cover it in this book, but there are within parliamentary institutions, there are challenges as to why we have representatives, say, for example, who spend less time on joint parliamentary committees. I'm sitting in Australia. They have a very sort of systemized institution for providing research support to the members of parliament. In India, we do not have that. So politicians are often on time crunch and do not have that expertise or research support Our research mechanism, from what I understand, of the parliamentary secretariat is quite ad hoc. So some of these concerns are, which are empirical concerns, require more empirical solutions, which perhaps I and Tarun can discover if we write the English version. So that I just wanted to contextualize where that democracy conversation was. But thank you so much for reading it so closely. It has given me a lot more to think about. Coming to Rochana's question about the dilemmas of translation, they were a lot. They were quite a lot. First on the Hindi in the Constitution. Now, the constitutional Hindi is slightly better, just slightly better than the legal Hindi we generally see. And I saw the Home Minister making a comment today that science, technology, and judiciary should operate in Hindi. But if you look at legal Hindi, it's very, very hard. Contract is called Samvida. Who calls contract Samvida today? Everybody, even a Hindi speaker, calls contract. So we have tried not to use a lot of legal Hindi because very difficult. But the one challenge that I personally faced is that I've studied in a Hindi medium school, and that was a school which used quite Sanskritized Hindi. And then I lived in Lucknow, where I got some glimpses of Urdu. So I would tend to go in extreme. I would start using Urdu words or Sanskritized Hindi words. And then Tarun would, in the multiple rounds of editing, trying to balance that out. So that was a bit of a challenge. And sometimes the other point with Hindi also is that because we have not engaged in producing quality scholarship in Hindi, it's sometimes very hard to come up Hindi word for some of the technical terms. So that was another challenge, that the language itself sometimes seemed insufficient. And I'm not an expert in Hindi language, but just as a constitutional person trying to write it, we were short of words sometimes and had to sometimes use the English word because the Hindi word was just not fitting. So that's the dilemma of translation. Now, your other question that I just wanted to respond was on decolonial constitution and stability as value. In my understanding of reading of the Constitution, stability, peace, and justice, these can be broadly the two aims of the Constitution. And having a structure that allows for those institutions of justice to operate, who pave the way for justice to operate, I think in that way, the stability can be seen as a good value that a constitution should perhaps aim for. But again, it's not complete defense of that all of the parts of the constitution need not change. As we said, the point was that we constantly tried making was that what are the institutions which perhaps need to be destabilized or entirely sort of be done away with, like, for example, office of the governor, it doesn't need to be stable, it perhaps needs to go away. So that's how I see the conversation on stability. And yeah, that's it. These were my responses. Thank you. But thanks again for inviting and reading so deeply.
Thanks, so we made my task a little easier. I'll just pick up some of the points where I have something to add or disagree with Surbhi. So first, let me start. So, libertarian is the new Nazi, right? And I'm going to return the favor to Udit by calling him a libertarian in a moment and get even. So, this is not necessarily Udit, but a lot of the energy that drives this anti-representative politics, anti-representative democracy, and it has colloquial, lazy, journalistic origins of all politicians of this. They're all in for themselves, right? It is, to my mind, fundamentally anti-institutional, and therefore libertarian. Its holy grail is the fully customized for the individual politics, where every individual can represent her own political party, make no compromises because compromise is a dirty word, rely on nobody else, not work with anybody else in any organization like a political party for common political goals. That, to my mind, is driving the direct democracy agenda. And by the way, the people who benefit from it, who in India, if you ask me to, is likely to benefit most from a direct democracy agenda, I have no doubt in stating my reputation that it is Prime Minister Modi. Right? Getting rid of political parties for all their flaws, of course, institutions, human institutions, because they are human, will be flawed. The challenge always, the question always is, do we improve them or do we get rid of them? And so, of course, Udit and I do not have sunlight between us on our views on the problem of oligarchies or plutocratic capture. But for every institution that's easy to capture, an individual is easier still. And forget capture. As somebody who is good friends with a civil society member on the Constitutional Council of one of the South Asian countries, I can tell you from anecdotal, yes, some are very scholarly. You don't need to capture an individual. All you need is an anonymous threatening phone call. Because the individual has no party to back them, has no defensive institution to support them. In weak rule of law contexts in particular, I think that this is a fantasy to imagine that partyless individuals can usher in the moral purity of the people in the public discourse. And I worry about it because, like many of the good progressive ideas, and I mentioned decoloniality earlier, will end up serving fascist goals. And I really worry about this. That the best way to ensure fascism is to target parties and the bad people. So I mean, Udit and I have had this debate many times, and I don't think we are going to convince each other. But for every evidence he has pointed, I can point to evidence on the contrary, including what is the evidence we have of direct democracy. We have evidence from the United States where directly democratic political primaries meant more and more and more extremist candidates. We have evidence from referendums in this country on Brexit. We have the Chilean experience of sort of directly democratic party-less or party-light constitution making and so on, right? So, so of course, that is a deeply normative position in the book. Of course, I'm going to defend it because part of our goal of accessibility was, you'll see how thin this book is, right? And it was made very clear to us that if the book is to sell, it has to be small, right? Because the size of the book is one of the biggest things that puts people off. Right? So we had to write a short book, and I have defended my idea elsewhere in English, and I'm happy to share it. The second thing is a misreading. So this idea of competition as disciplining political leaders, to my mind, is not sufficient, but it is necessary. And it is necessary because I do think that the experience acquired by dealing with people who disagree with you violently, is only something you can get in politics. And the more you have that, the better a politician you become. If you are going to be elected through sortition and not dependent on votes, you don't have to do that. You don't have to go and meet people who disagree with you to get to the office. It's a virtue to habituate yourself to criticism, and often extremely unfair. The tragedy is that most people who criticize politicians as a group, every time you ask them about any individual politician they know, will have very good things to say about that individual. And I think that we really need to start judging politicians like we judge ourselves and other human institutions, because democracy is a still. On some of Rochana's points, so the Constitution itself has a directive principle that the state shall endeavor to develop Hindi, drawing upon multiple languages, including Hindustani, right? And what we were doing was following the constitution. They're both not very well, but predominantly the Indian state has given up on that directive a long time ago. Rochana, so isn't it's a good thing. This is in some ways this challenge, similar to the challenge to this post to us. I mean, no prizes for guessing that my instincts and surveys are incremental. We like institutions, we like to improve them, but we don't like to get rid of them. And yes, this is in our temperament, but this is also a feature of these factors. And I think the starting point matters. You know, would I be an incrementalist if your starting point of the constitution you have is awful? I don't know. But I think if it is something that's reasonably good, and the chances that any replacement will be a lot worse, you better stick to it and try to improve it from within rather than seek replacement. And secondly, the waiting for revolution people have a lot greater appetite for collateral damage scenario. Fast constitutional changes come with fast political and social upheaval, and there is enormous human cost that accompanies those upheaval, and I just simply do not accept that kind of collateral damages acceptable. And also history does not have many examples of very successful revolutions, which led to good things, all things considered. So I think that we need to improve things. In the Indian context, I think we have a fairly decent starting position, at least on the big picture in big aspirational stuff. And finally, on the liberalism point, actually two points, right? One is liberalism and the constitution. What's the relationship? So, like democracy, I don't believe democracy is or should be the only legitimating virtue underpinning our institutions. I don't think liberalism is that either. I'm a moral fox, not a moral hedgehog. I believe in moral pluralism. I think that the human condition is that we care about, and we should care about many things, not just one thing. And the problem is that when we start caring about that one thing to the exclusion of all others, that is when we become zealots. And that is when we cannot see the complexity of human existence. And that is why I think that yes, liberty is important, and the Constitution sees liberty is important, but not the sole thing we should care about. Obviously, what really complicates the Constitution story is partition. It's being written under the shadow of partition, and that changes everything. So there's a deep constitutional aversion to partition and the violence of partition and the deaths, the murders, the rapes, and the assaults of partition. And that, even these wise, mostly men, but not all men, had limitations and could not avoid the emotional reactions that kind of mad genocidal violence instigates. And we have the constitution we have, but for me, those aversive dimensions, the weak rights protection, for example, is part of that second nuts and bolts layer that we should seek to eradicate.
Thank you. As chair, I'm going to misuse my permission. We'll take 3 questions at a time, and let me first misuse my position as chair to ask the first one. Francesca, you are the second, and then the gentleman behind you. I could sort of frame my question along the lines of hatred of democracy, excess democracy, or some other notion of the constitution and the stream. But in some ways, let me just kind of look at one sort of thing that seems to be missing from your table of contents, and that is samprabhuta, sovereignty. And the sort of question in flux, who is the subject of sovereignty as mentioned in the preamble to the Constitution? And I'd like to have you look at the kind of dirty marketplace of ideas, which is Twitter, for example, and kind of look at some particular elements of that. So, for example, very popular in the last few months, reference to Modi as the priest king. With a picture of that famous head from Harappa, And that says something about what is the push towards making a kind of change in the constitution in the minds of the people. What someone like Rohit Day might say, kind of the people's constitution and the everyday life of law. And connected to that, terminology, like on television, when the last election happened and Modi won or the BJP won, people are not using words like, oath-taking ceremony or Shapat Grahan. They now say Rajabhishek, coronation. So the subject of the sovereign as the popular sovereign can have two very split meanings, or at least two very split meanings. And it seems that the push is to gravitate towards a very fundamentally anti-democratic one, while making the argument that that is, in a Schmittian sense, the truly democratic one. So I just want you to respond to that one, but let's take a question there.
Sure, it's a question, but I was, when I saw the announcement last year, I was in a village near Sultanpur, taken to a local primary school where a very dedicated teacher, she's increased the school from, I think, 8 to 60 children, Muslim majority village. Some children recite poems, one child gets up and recites the preamble of the Constitution, the whole preamble in English, very proudly. And for me, it was a real strong moment. And the idea that for this village, the teacher and the children think that in the context of what we know, that's something to learn by heart and stand proudly by. And the second point, so I hope that the book is for them, in a way. I hope that the book is something that they can read and and it's not too difficult. And then I'm thinking of an Italian example. As you may know, there's been a lot of calls to change the Italian constitution, which is also, post-war, post-fascist, so strong statement of change. And there's been a judge, a magistrate, who was very much involved in the, clean hands, anti-corruption operation, who's been going around schools, explaining to children what the Constitution is about. And he's written not one, but in fact several books. And I was just looking up which, what these books are. One is the Constitution Explained to Children, which is, I don't know how far, your book is like that. And the other is the Constitution Through Children's Questions, which I think it could be, I would like you to push to maybe, I don't know if it's something you do already, but maybe do it, to go to schools and explain to children or talk to children and teachers, and then get a sense of what their questions are, what do they understand as the Constitution, and then try to write a book about the Constitution that again does not try to translate from English, but try to say, and I really very applaud your use of English and English words. Doesn't try to to use this very should Hindi that is everybody's.
So there's a question right behind you, and in
So
fact,
just stopping there and just thinking about maybe the other question about
bit time, definitely.
yeah, sorry, syntax.
Let's take one.
Language, and is it a question about translating words or is it about loosening syntax? Because it seems to me that one of the big problems when one thinks in English and tries to write in Hindi is that the syntax then becomes so like a jail over the or a prison over the sentence.
So can I just say, in the interest of time, let's have, I think there's one question or not at all. There's one question there, there's one in the back, and there's one online.
Yeah.
Let's have that, please be brief, and then let's see which ones Surbhi and Tarun might want to go for. So please go ahead with the question from online, and then after that, you, and then you. Thanks.
Yeah. So this question is by Prerna Dhruv, who's a PhD candidate at King's. She asked, do you think that military as an institution, militarism as a value and militarization as a process has been continuously invoked by the present government to seek popularity and acceptance amongst Indians?
Okay, please.
Thank you. First, my congratulations to the authors. I haven't had the opportunity to read the book, so maybe my question is, in that sense, a little out of place. This question is in continuation of what Mr. Rochana said. I see as I read Constitution and its interpretations by the courts over time, two almost not only different, diametrically opposite trends when it comes to the role of the state in economics and the envisaged role of the state in, say, political rights. Given our previous 100+ years of history, there is a near explicit suspicion of capital and markets, and we can see massive role for the state, including redistribution of assets, etc., notwithstanding the explicit right to property. Equally, on the other hand, when it came to political rights like liberty, life, clearly it is the opposite. These two actually coexist very uncomfortably. And we can see this very clearly in the way the Constitution effectively and the courts have approached the fourth branch, for instance. Would you have a comment on this?
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. And then, wait, put it very briefly, if you can.
Yes.
Thank you.
Say who you are, sorry.
Sorry, my name is Aradhya. I used to actually write a column on the Indian Constitution in Daily Bhaskar long ages ago. And I found the exercise particularly difficult because it almost appeared to me that I was thinking about two different subjects when I'm writing about it in English and when I'm writing about it in Hindi. I thought that I couldn't just end an argument by using the terminology like liberalism or even translating it into Darwin and explaining the Constitution. So my question to you at that point, that's the background in which I'm asking this question, is did you change your mind or think about any concept differently while writing about the Constitution in Hindi? And I don't mean just finding words to explain the ideas that you already have in English, but actually thinking about it. That's it. Thank you.
Please, whichever set of questions either of you would like to take in 5 minutes.
Yep, I will.
Okay.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
I think on the sovereignty question, we've not talked of per se a lot on sovereignty, but on democracy and popular vote, we talked about democracy and majoritarian, trying to explain that majoritarianism necessarily doesn't fulfill the criteria of democracy. And we have in that particular reference also talked of the voting system that we have, which if you look at the Modi government's vote share, I think it is around 37% and then 31% something. So it's not the majority of India, it's the first past the post system. So some of that is reflected in the book, but we've not gotten a chance to talk about sovereignty in detail. Tarun may want to add on that. Now, about children and book, there are a couple of great children's book published from Bhopal, and I was looking, they do have some interesting book with drawings, etc., on children, on Constitution, and I'm hopeful to look more at that. NCRT, the previous books, I'm not seeing the revised versions, but previous ones did a really good job of explaining some of these values. I used to teach my cousins with those books, but I'm not sure what is happening, which makes it even more important to have something for children. And for schools, when I was in undergrad, we used to do some of these sessions in school, and Rajesh's organization still does it. So yeah, that's hopefully something more would come on it. On military, yeah, we've not talked about military a lot in our book. Maybe if we write the next version, maybe something to say there. We find some of mention of it in reference to that we were talking of federalism issues around that and special status of states, but not a lot. And I couldn't hear the last two questions very clearly, so I'll leave those to Tarun.
Thanks very much, Surbhi. So there are many gaps in the book. It's not just sovereignty. There's no chapter on language. There is no chapter on fraternity. So there's a lot of. I mean, the founders obviously are speaking of sovereignty. I suspect in a very particular context of political decolonization and sovereignty from the colonial state. This is not going to be a dominion, this is going to be a sovereign state, right? But I mean, the monarchical turn, the public discourse and this Rashtrapati, hugely important phenomenon that we're not talking about enough. Extremely critical. Think about what it means. Francesca, what a great story. About the preamble being decided in the fiscal. And, I mean, so the moment in the last 6 years has been extraordinary, right? From the Patalgari movement in Jharkhand, where village squares have provisions of the constitution chiseled in the sacred stone, to the Navsarjan movement in Gujarat, using the constitutional vocabulary for direct land rights claims.
Also for weddings, by the way.
And weddings, yeah. There was a mosque in, I think, Bombay, which put a slab with the preamble inscribed on it inside the walls of the mosque. There's a group called Reclaiming Constitution. Vinay Kumar is a key individual. He's remarkable, and he is actually he is being key contributor to the exhibition that has been put up at SOAS. He is an engineer by training and just decided to make constitutional literacy his life's mission. He goes around the country printing preamble, the preamble on T-shirts, on tote bags, on mugs, talking about the Constitution's artwork, because the original Constitution had commissioned artists to also decorate the book with sort of artworks. So, he's doing, one of the things he's running for school kids is a Constitution quiz, where sort of 13 to 16-year-olds can form teams and participate in an annual quiz, and there's the big prize, which is the visit to the president's palace and the palace, that word, right?
Yeah.
President's house, not palace. But again, increasingly hearing the word palace being used. So there is something going on in the country where Constitution, interestingly, is, you cannot think of something more establishment than the Constitution, has become the symbol of resistance. And this interesting sort of movement from the center to the periphery is both, it's going to do interesting things to the Constitution if it's allowed. I don't think it will leave it unmarked. The Constitution, which is a fantastic idea. Just reminded me of an anecdote. When I was 14, there was a book fair in my small town in Bengal, and I went to the law books store in the book fair, and I asked for a copy of the Constitution, and the guy refused to sell it to me. He said it's not for kids. And it took me 5 more years to figure out what's in that book, because everybody talks about it. Nobody around me knew what's in it, because I was asked this before the internet. Right? So,
We had to memorialize the preamble when I was in school in small towns of Bihar.
I really went to the wrong school. Militarization brain, I think you're right. In Surbhi has answered it. Other tensions between the state and the that's not a specifically Indian problem. I mean, the state is complicated because on the one hand, as the massive concentration of enormous political power, it is scary and we're right to be scared of it and try to contain it. On the other hand, as a massive concentration of political power, it is the only entity that can take on massive economic and social power. So, I mean, we are just doomed to deal with this love-hate relationship that we have to have in the state, and the Constitution has tried to engage with it, probably a bit more rose-tinted about the state than it should have been, but there we are. And Aradhya, what a fantastic question. I need to think more about whether writing the book has made me think differently about it. What it has done, though, and this came out in some of Udit's questions as well, is you're absolutely right that when you're writing in Hindi, it's not just a matter of translation. You write differently. And for me, the most important thing was we could not take anything for granted. and we could not assume any background knowledge. So we had to go back to first principles on everything. And whether it's liberalism, whether it's democracy, whether it's whatever, and that forced us to think about what do we think about liberalism, right? And as you saw with actually with it, right? We've taken controversial positions about it, right? So we're not pretending that we're just giving a summary and we decide what we want of it, right? We have said this is our preferred view, but I don't think that we could have written the book in Hindi without going back to first principles and some history on all of these concepts. But a great question. I need to think more about it and maybe reread the book myself.
I think we're out of time.
We are, unless there are any burning questions, we can continue the discussion over drinks downstairs in the exhibition. So it remains for me to thank our audience, our speakers, Tarunabh Khaitan, Surbhi Karwa, our chair, Subir Sinha,
Our host.
Udit Bhatia, and Nida, who has set us all up. Thank you very much.